You need a year, right? So you can see your face. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our viewers from Fiji to Turkey of the Asia Pacific region and beyond. My name is Jose, and to our viewers, thank you very much for joining us today to our second of the series of Productivity Talk organized by the Asian Productivity Organization, or the APO. The APO is an intergovernmental organization in the Asia Pacific region with 21 member countries and with Secretariat Office in Tokyo, Japan. Today, we have a lecture presentation on the topic, the economics of COVID-19 and its implications for productivity in the Asia Pacific region. To share to us his insights, expertise, and knowledge on the issue, we are honored to have Professor Emeritus Hak Kil Pyo, an economist and visiting scholar at the Asia Center of Seoul National University. Good afternoon, Professor Pyo.
Thank you for inviting me. Good afternoon.
Professor Pyo served as president of the Korea International Economic Association and a member of the Presidential Commission for Policy Planning. He also worked as a consultant in the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and the Institute of Developing Economies in Tokyo. He was also the chairman of the Asia KLEMS or CLEMS committee and now serves as an advisor. We would like to encourage our viewers to send your questions and comments in the chat corner for Professor Pyo to answer after his presentation. Now we would like to invite Professor Pyo for his presentation.
Thank you for inviting me for this very valuable opportunity to share some of my views and analytical results with the APO member countries and related audiences. Let me open the slide and to share, and the title is entitled The Economics of COVID-19 and its Implications for Productivity in the Asia Pacific region. As you know, we are in the middle of a very terrible sort of pandemic. Okay, so my talk today will consist of roughly about 8 topics, subtopics. COVID-19 as a global pandemic. We'll take a preview of global pandemic, and then we'll move to new Asian contagion and economics of COVID-19 as a conceptual background, and also productivity shocks of COVID-19 pandemic. And also we will take a look at health policy and strategies and macroeconomic policy imperatives for Asia Pacific region. And then we will move on to think about what could be the next normal emerging from Asia. So finally, I will share some of my productivity projection outlook in Asia Pacific economy after COVID-19. COVID-19 as a global pandemic. As all of you know well, WHO declared the coronavirus outbreak as a global pandemic, March 11, 2020. And to my judgment, it was somewhat declared a little bit too late. That is the reason why right now WHO and Trump administration are engaged in a kind of debate whether or not the declaration was too late or timely declaration and so forth. When I looked at this coronavirus outbreak as a pandemic, I searched for some economic theoretical background, and I found Professor Jack Hauser of Harvard University he first wrote about the economics of catastrophes. And he mentioned about 1995 Hanshin earthquake in Japan, 2011 East Japan earthquake, as you know, of Richter scale 9.0, and also AIDS virus spread by 2018, 770,000 people died. So it was kind of a natural sort of pandemic, and coinciding with a lot of human errors and human mistakes and so forth. Coronavirus, though, is a very unique and explosive pandemic. For example, AIDS virus, it is catastrophe, but very limited to inappropriate sexual relationship and was spread to specific multiple. For example, MERS, MERS, another pandemic, lasted 3 years before its complete fade out. So we may have to tolerate maybe even prolonged sort of duration of this spread this time. Coronavirus pandemic is explosive spread to non-specific mass. It's not specific multiple, but non-specific multiples. Lockdown approach became inevitable, therefore, according to Wikipedia and WHO, the Spanish influenza lasted 1 full year from June 1918 to May 1919, with 3 consecutive sort of explosion. So coronavirus pandemic, which we are experiencing, we are battling with, could have a multiple explosion. And we are very afraid of that possibility of multiple explosion. I will focus more on the sort of spread into Asian contagion, because today we are sharing our thoughts about Asian economies and the impacts of contagion on Asian economies. In general, developing economies face higher risks in densely populated South and Southeast Asia. Much lower health system capacity does exist throughout the South and Southeast Asia and some of the Pacific Basin countries. People have less possibility to wash hands with soap, and economic structures are more exposed to the world trade cycle, dependent on advanced economies demand, and more vulnerable to the crisis. For example, a recent review of US flight reduction is going to cause a massive decline in industrial demand for Asia Pacific routes. Almost 98.1% is being cut off from US flight in terms of destination. Far less access to the internet, and therefore far more disruptions from working at home. For example, construction sites and many retail shops and many service industries are not necessarily connected well with the internet, and therefore internet working environment is very fragile. After China, COVID-19 spread it to Korea and Japan with higher medical capacity, causing concerns in Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam, and Thailand, and other Southeast Asian and South Asian economies, where medical capacities are much lower, and where we can have a more densely populated area. So this COVID-19 is going to cause deep economic recession and depression. For example, as you know, first impact is upon global oil markets, because demand for oil has been cut by airline industry, by transportation, by any sort of mobile activities have been cut, and therefore oil demand has been sharply declined, and oil price has gone down significantly. And if you look at recent projections by major international institutions like World Bank is forecasting 2.5% very low world sort of GDP outlook, and OECD is sharing almost the same magnitude of GDP reduction growth rate in terms of growth rate. Goldman Sachs 2.0%. Bloomberg is forecasting almost 0% growth rate on world scale. WTO's forecast as of April 8th, real GDP growth rate, even if it is under optimistic scenario, they are forecasting like a minus 2.5% reduction. Pessimistic case, minus 8.8% reduction. And world trade volume is even larger in terms of magnitude of reduction. Optimistic case, minus 13%, pessimistic case, minus 32%. So these are very gloomy outlook. And also it has a lot of impacts on unemployment and finances. For example, ILO is predicting the loss of working hours in Asia during the second quarter of 2020 is equivalent to 125 million people unemployed due to shutdown of factories and shops in China and other Asian countries. UBS is predicting US can reach unemployment rate like as high as 12.6%, and $950 billion of mortgage loans can be defaulted. And OECD is predicting that composite leading index is moving toward the worst reduction. Institute of International Finance is forecasting national bonds total issued in March by countries could reach 2.1 trillion US dollars. ILO reports, for example, unemployed person, Asia Pacific region, occupying world totals 64%, 125 million. And high-risk industries occupies about 38% of the entire industrial structure of the economy. So the impacts on Asia in general will not be light. It will be very heavy because of the lack of infrastructure in medical capacity. At the same time, because of the fact that many unemployment will occur in so-called informal area. For example, 59% of non-farm employment in China and India has informal labor. In addition, for example, in India, they say that 9% of workers are working in informal economy related jobs. So that means when this COVID-19 shock comes through, these restaurants, these retail shops and the construction sites are not prepared, and therefore they will have to cut off informal workers first and then move into part-time workers, and ultimately they may have to lay off full-time workers in many major industries. For example, there is an ongoing debate on economic outlook. First, Professor Rubini of NYU has predicted I-shaped, very depression-like long stagnation. So one of the gloomiest picture. Professor Krugman has put this crisis as a permanent recession. And ex-chairman of Federal Reserve System, Ben Bernanke, has once predicted rather very short-term depression and recession and V-shaped recovery, quick recovery, but he changed his prediction recently due to explosive outbreak in the United States. For example, according to his recent interview online conference, he was predicting that second quarter of GDP in US will be reduced by 30%. It's kind of staggering magnitude. And the prolonged recession after the second quarter will make V-shaped quick recovery impossible. And probably we will have a sort of delayed and L-shaped recovery. But we have to also pay attention to, like Professor Romer's proposition that he was saying that he was advocating limited social distancing and partial lockdown policy to some extent, rather than full-scale lockdown policy, because he says, according to what he said, if I quote it correctly, we may live, but the economy will die. It's a New York Times article, March 23. Therefore, he was advocating like Sweden type initial policy, limited social distancing and instead of full lockdown, limited partial lockdown policy. But as of now, the global spread of COVID-19 is faster and wider and persistent, to my judgment, with no immediate outlook of slowdown. So L-shaped, prolonged recession and prolonged, therefore, recovery seems more likely than before. Productivity shocks of COVID-19 pandemic can come through over 4 stages. And the first stage, many disruption may exist across the supply chain and value chain. Hardest sectors will be tourism, airline industry, oil and gas, automotives, consumer products, consumer electronics, and semiconductors. Second stage can come in the form of unemployment source from lower skilled jobs affecting aggregate demand. So therefore, for example, 51% of US population could be affected by this second stage productivity shocks. Okay. And third stage, if the real sector productivity shocks become spreaded, then there will be a liquidity sort of crisis coming from a lot of bankruptcies filed banks, filed by many firms. And for example, demand and supply loop similarly to create financial crisis. Final stage, unemployed workers have no income, therefore lower consumption. Finally, stress firms cut off for the workforce. And this is a very tragic scenario, but large reduction of economic surplus is inevitable. So this kind of creates a loop. For example, first stage, you can see aggregate supply curve is cut back because of some of the factories were shut down. For example, some of subsidiary firms, factories in China owned by Korean automakers had to shut down. Therefore, that affects second stage aggregate demand in Korea. For example, Korean factories and Korean firms had to go through some partial knockdown. And then that affects another round of aggregate supply. and therefore total aggregate demand shifts down. So it is kind of loop. In other words, productivity shocks create kind of consecutive loop and out of this COVID-19 pandemic. So we can expect rising inequality as a consequence. A new Asian contagion of COVID-19, as you can see, first spread it by China, then moved very quickly to Korea, Japan, and now most of the Asian countries are affected. Even though relatively Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Vietnam has maintained very low death ratio, mortality ratio, compared to, for example, China or other nations. I'm not expert on health policy, but health policy and strategies should be considered, and we should pay deep attention to the health policy and strategies, because ultimately this is the source of impacts upon economic activity. So the only option left over is design and deploy an efficient testing system, identify infected fast, and isolate the infected and trace the source. Social distancing and self-isolation are the key elements. And experience in South Korea demonstrates the effectiveness of these policies. For example, in many countries, the explosion, if explosion comes out at early stage, healthcare system cannot be kept alive. Above the limit healthcare system capacity, this explosion is at early stage is very dangerous. So that's why people and the governments try to make social distancing and self-isolation policy imperative, because of the reason to flatten this curve, so that their endogenous healthcare system can absorb the shock to some extent. So prolonged, even though economic distress cannot be avoided from being stretched out, but this seems to be almost viable solution to health crisis. And suppression strategy seems to be inevitable. So what is the macroeconomic policy imperatives for Asia Pacific region? As recently announced by US, they are going to spend about 15% of GDP in fiscal stimulus packaging. In addition, I want you to pay particularly their policy option, PPP policy option, Payments Protection Program, of the magnitude first stage $500 billion, and second stage $250 billion in addition to 500. So large magnitude of Payments Protection Program is to let employers keep their labor force. So government instead protect their salaries and benefits. And Payments Protection Program is government is trying to subsidize the failing companies to some extent. EU is considering 15% of GDP, and Korea is debating right now over about 10% of GDP package. Okay. So out of all this mess in fiscal policy arena and also financial policy arena, there has been a sort of hot debated topic recently compiled by Economist magazine and McKinsey and Company's sort of research report. The question that has been raised is that could the next normal emerge from Asia? What would be next normal emerging from Asia? And Economist is predicting acceleration trend in adjusting global supply network due to COVID-19 related trade war. So for example, global companies like Apple will increase inventory and parts and components near US, not necessarily in China or in India, far away from US mainland, and will assemble them using smart factory technology. So their profit rate will decline, but they will become more resilient in recovery from shocks like COVID-19. Global demand for electronic commerce, digital payment system, and remote work practices, including biology, health-related reform, will increase. Cross-border investment in 2020 will decline by 30 to 40%. Therefore, I predict like the countries, economies like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Myanmar, Bangladesh, all very hot in terms of cross-border investment, recipient countries. The demand for cross-border investment will very drastically decline, so that these economies need to be prepared for sudden reduction of cross-border investment. McKinsey predicts that the next normal will be a transition from globalization and regionalization. So toward regionalization from globalization, that's what they mean. COVID-19 demonstrates that global supply chain is very fragile. For example, global companies, particularly Japanese automakers, for example, Korean electronics firms, may shift supply network from China to other Asian regions. But about this assessment, I have some reservation. So for example, my prediction is shifting supply network from China to other Asian regions may happen very more slowly over time because global investors in China, including Japanese automakers and Korean electronics firms and German automakers and so forth, had invested in China to make an access to Chinese market. This Chinese market itself is very large market rather than cost concerns, cost factors. So therefore, I think it will be very difficult for them to move away their factories from China and move into regionalized, more other Southeast Asian countries as origin of their assembly and sort of parts and component supply. So that will take time, and that may not happen overnight. Finally, we can take a look at conjecture what would happen to productivity outlook in Asia Pacific economies after 19. As I mentioned, we will be affected by a series of productivity shocks. Those shocks will form kind of loop. First, affecting supply, then demand, and then supply again, and then demand. So this productivity shock in the form of loop will create kind of very gloomy picture in productivity performance in many Asia Pacific economies. Briefly, aggregate productivity measurement, as you know, we can in aggregate sense measure per capita by per capita gross national income. This is most aggregate measure of population labor productivity, and it is to some extent welfare index of the economy. But more meaningful productivity index would be per employee GDP, in other words, GDP by number of employees. And this can be measured at industry level, at economy-wide level, at company level, or plant level. And it measures efficiency of labor input. In addition to all of that, we have to pay attention to the trend in total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is measurement of overall efficiency and value added divided by combined inputs of capital and labor. So, for example, even if a lot of labor can be expected to be cut off, if capital complements to some extent labor cut off, then they can maintain high total factor productivity. So it depends on ultimately overall efficiency of the economy in question, the industry in question, the company and worksite plant level in question, how they will have to fight against declining total factor productivity and lift up total factor productivity. Labor is important element, determinant, but it is not all the picture. So we have to also, at the company level in Asian economies, you have to think about how to promote total factor productivity in addition to labor productivity. So this is the last slide I conjectured and forecasted from my research lab. Per capita GNI, and the most recent record is available up to 2018. So 2020, I almost predicted a very slim, slight increase in per capita GNI. Even though the gloomy picture is ahead of us, but I think many of our Asian economies will be resilient in recovering from the shocks. And I hope many of the APO member countries could make improvement in overall efficiency and could survive from this almost depression-like economic conditions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Pyo. Can you close that slide? Thank you very much, Professor Pyo. So I believe our viewers have learned a lot from your presentation, and maybe they have a lot of questions. And we would like to collect some of your questions. We have time for the Q&A. So I have already gathered some questions, but let me start by asking Professor Pyo some of these. I think this is what we see every day in the news, and it has something to do with the situation. One question is that, like, we see that in many countries in the region have initiated like a shutdown or lockdown for a few weeks, like sometimes end of this month or until early May, for example. So what will happen to the local economy in this situation? How will the people be able to, live during this time? And the economy is not that alive, and in one of your slides you mentioned that we don't want to die, but the economy will probably die. So what will be the situation, especially after this lockdown or shutdown of the economy for 2 weeks or 1 month?
Okay. First, I have observed the lockdown policy and self-isolation policy, social distancing, from the case of Korean government push toward sort of suppression policy. And it seems to be working effectively though, because if you do not step in, if government does not really step in this mess of epidemic and pandemic, then what happens is prolonged spread of persistent sort of spread. And persistent spread is not only dangerous for economic consequences, but also it's dangerous because the medical capacity can be very much limited. So to tackle with that, some measure of government policy is very important. Government intervention is very important. Particularly, this is a public health issue rather than private health issue. And I have observed it in this matter, it is very important whether or not national insurance program is covering the test of this spread, infectedness, or the approving actually final stage that potential patient as a real patient, and then to take care of medical care. One of the reasons why Korea has been relatively successful in maintaining this repression policy is because of our nationwide healthcare system. And so that many people who have been endangered are very positive in going to test site and have a self-test or have testing done by the public hospitals. And one of the reasons why, for example, in America or in the rest of like Italy and in many European countries, because of the medical costs of testing and also going through cure system through as a patient is too costly for in many countries. So that really makes the health policy and related insurance policy, national insurance coverage, very important safety net for all economies throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pyo. We have a question here from our viewers. Please allow me to raise them randomly as they appeared in our screen here. So one question is raised here by Mark Reynald. His question is, what is your suggested policy on productivity to prevent further economic recession while reducing COVID-19 mortalities?
Yes, as I try to convey my sort of reaction and the policy reaction suggested is the productivity shocks will come through the plants, come through the firms, come through the industry and at economy-wide level as a kind of 4-stage waves. First time, for example, they will be supply bottlenecked. In other words, their parts and components may not be supplied to them in adequate fashion, fast enough. So what they do, they have to cut off their production. After cutting off production, they will have to cut off their labor, to survive. And then cutting off labor means a lot of demand reduction on the nationwide scale. So that demand reduction comes from also foreign side. For example, recently, Korean firms are experiencing over 30% reduction in foreign demand for their exports. Just the last quarter, Korean firms are experiencing 30% reduction in export demand. That is a very staggering amount for them to survive. So usually this comes in waves as a loop, as I try to explain it. So therefore, the best strategy for firms and also industries is to recover this from kind of productivity shocks in stabilized manner. In other words, trying to cut off labor is not, of course, at times seems inevitable, but it might not be the best strategy. Trying to recover demand side, their policy affecting demand will also have to combine with the supply shock. therapies, for example. So in other words, they may have to move toward the strategy of, even if they have to sacrifice labor productivity, they may have to move to lift up overall total factor productivity, overall efficiency. For example, suppose they had to cut off a lot of labor, then they have to complement labor force by IT-related technological investment, for example, so that overall efficiency in the form of total factor productivity could be lifted up. So that kind of a more flexible productivity management strategy seems inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question here from Nikhil Joshi. In one of your slides, I think the question is based on the idea of moving from globalization to regionalization. His question is, when you say regionalization, do you mean companies will be serving more local and regional demand only?
Yeah, I think the movement toward regionalization is seemingly inevitable, but the speed toward that regionalization will be not as remarkably high as many of the reports predict. The reason is because from globalization to regionalization, it is very costly transition to some extent. And also, as I illustrated, for example, multinational enterprises, global companies, which already have invested heavily in China or in India, very difficult to move their facilities and their commitments into these global market to regionalized market, regionalized sort of area. So that will take some time, but it seems to be this is this policy of epidemic and in the pandemic is teaching us a lesson. Too much globalization, too much centered on facility has a lot of risk to some extent. So they will reconsider too much concentration and globalization. For example, China is consuming roughly 40 to 50% of entire raw material. They are the origins of the demand, lump sum demand for all natural resources and intermediate goods. So therefore, that's why a lot of global companies had invested in China, mainland China. But of course, they have already committed a lot of resources to China, and it will be very difficult for them to get away from China, I think. So regionalization may take time. Regionalization may take some pace, some time to be realized. That's my prediction. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pyo. I think I have a follow-up question to that because I think it's now it's a common knowledge now that countries like China, Korea, Germany, or US, for example, we are all parts of the global value chains. So if we talk about regionalization, so what will be the future look like when actually our economies, are connected to these big economies, and they are, across the world, like the US, the Europe, and even the region. So how do we look at that scenario? If we look at regionalization, at the same time, we are connected to a much bigger economy, the world economy.
Right. So I think there is a movement from globalization moving toward regionalization. But that regionalization, by which I mean it should be regionalized centers, it's not necessarily across all countries they will be regionalized. For example, Vietnam, Indonesia, for example, or countries like Myanmar could be next center for the regionalization effort. And then also they will try to assemble the products nearer to their home site. In other words, for example, Amazon, Apple, all these global companies will try to do something near to their home site so that the risks of globalization can be minimized to some extent. So that means the pattern of value chain and may be affected. The pattern of value chain may be affected by this transition from globalization toward regionalization. But as I said, they invested in China, not necessarily because China has one of the cheapest sources of resource materials or wage rates. They invested in China, global companies, as a market access, as a means of market access to very global market, which is Chinese market. So therefore, that's why I predict the regionalization will not come overnight. It will take some time because they are basing their Chinese factories and companies to cover China as a main source of demand. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so we have question also from our viewers. Let me just combine some of the questions. Like we have question from Vietnam and another question which is similar to Mr. Danilo Pulma. Actually, we see that the SMEs, the informal sector, or the household-based industries are seriously affected in the current situation because, like, obviously the informal sector, there's no physical market where to sell their goods, and the SMEs cannot produce because people are not allowed to report to the factory in some instances. So how are we going to respond to these situations now and in the post-COVID scenario to be able to help these sectors and because they contribute much to the economy? So any idea this time and in the post-COVID scenario?
Well, again, I will make two observations. Of course, this spread of COVID-19 is raising many issues. One of the cross-country comparison shows me that, for example, Vietnam, Singapore, Taiwan, and relatively to some extent South Korea has been successfully controlling the spread of this disease, the contagion. And there must be some reason. Also, Hong Kong has been relatively very successful. I suspect it has a lot of things connected to public health system, I think, to some extent. But at the same time, the role of government, to some extent, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea, and Vietnam, including Vietnam, these are the countries with relatively high hands by the government. In other words, government is not only just one economic unit, a government sort of initiates some kind of public policy to some extent. So more sort of strong government, where the stronger government exists to some extent. It's not a laissez-faire economy, more sort of interventionist economy to some extent. These economies have been relatively successful in limiting the spread of the virus incident, which means, therefore, how are they going to manage protecting small and medium enterprises and households? These are all also a very important issue. But I'm guardedly optimistic about their policy capacity in protecting their small and medium enterprises and households, because relatively their fiscal budget situation and fiscal deficit is relatively in better shape than many of other economies in Latin American countries or in the Middle East or in the, for example, European, particularly Southern European countries. So that means even though they may face very hard time, difficult time to tackle, to protect their small and medium enterprises and households, but at the same time, they have relatively maintained fiscal debt in check to some extent. And therefore, I think relatively they may spare better. And all of these countries are designing the protection program for small and medium enterprises and household sector. So I'm guardedly optimistic.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. Because actually, we are all aware that this informal sector or the SMEs help a lot in the economy, and I think one of your presentations we talk about labor productivity. So if a huge amount of population is not working, so basically they don't contribute to productivity.
Right.
At the national front, but they are counted in that case as part of the input of population. So we have another question here, sir. The question is, economies are now injecting stimulus. I think that's one of your example of the slides, like those countries like the US, to increase capital flows, for example, for keeping the economy alive. But what would happen on productivity once COVID is over? Could you suggest how to bring back productivity? Because this is, I would say, government-induced, initiative. So they put a lot of money, just like Korea and in other countries now. I think that they put a lot of money. So what is your view about it, and how do we relate that to productivity of the country later?
Yeah. So, for example, very much it depends on the economic structure of each nation along Asia Pacific region. For example, very much dependent on natural resources. For example, Brunei or Malaysia and all these economies, for example, Indonesia, well, we're very much dependent on natural resources. There are also other nations like Vietnam and Laos and all other Thailand, very much affected by the reduction in tourism and reduction in airline passengers and so forth. In addition, those economies which must be mostly affected would be those nations which have been very hot bases for cross-border investment. So investment flow in will be particularly declining. So in other words, how to handle sudden decline, reduction in investment inflow will be the very big issue for those economies which were very large recipients of foreign investment. So now they have to put their priority on local priority areas. And at this point, I would like to emphasize the need for them to make investment in public safety, public health area. A lot of Southeast Asian economies and Pacific region economies did not pay enough attention to environmental protection as well as health-related investments, infrastructure. And the importance of health-related infrastructure investment is not to be exaggerated. In other words, investment in public health and investment in designing, let's say, national health system must be regarded as one of the best economic policy to increase their productivity. So after all, what is productivity? Output out of input. So to make input efficient, in other words, to make labor efficient labor, public safety and public health-related investment is one of the best infrastructure investment for most of Asian nations. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let me just go back to your slides. I noted that in two of your slides, you talk about these stages of shocks. You put them productivity shocks. So could you say that, I don't know if this is a loop that we keep going back. I don't know. So do you think countries in the region are into a specific stage, or they are all in these different stages? For example, like you put that in first stage, there was a disruption in the supply chain. And then the second stage, the unemployment problem source. And then firms, SMEs, for example, become dependent to cash flow, liquidity. And then stage 4 is you talk about unemployed workers balloon. So looks like it will become a serious problem, for the government to handle this. So how are we going to address this?
Okay, so if the economy is characterized by dependence on foreign sector, particularly in foreign demand, for example, tourism industry dependent on foreign travelers, foreign tourists, and so forth, the nature of the shock and the stages of shock they are arriving at will be different from one country to another. For example, the reduction of export demand, at least according to recent report, in South Korea was a lot larger than reduction in export demand in China, for example. Why? Because South Korea's dependence on foreign demand is a lot larger than relatively Chinese firms' dependence on foreign demand. So therefore, according to, if I'm wrong, I was mistaken, but probably my figure, it goes like China experiencing about minus 10% reduction of foreign demand. On the whole, South Korean firms are experiencing about, across the board, about 30% reduction in foreign demand. So, the stages of different shocks will arrive at each economy at different stage and over different sort of magnitude, at the same time over different speed of stages, for example, transition from one stage to another. But ultimately, the pattern will be the same. First, supply shock, and then demand shock creates another supply shock, and that creates larger demand shock. So in other words, the role of government fiscal policy is to stop somewhere, intervene somewhere throughout this 4-stage loop, supply shock and demand shock, another supply shock and demand shock. At some point, the government is trying to step in and try to sort of salvage the economy. And that's the role of government, fiscal policy.
Thank you, sir. So I think we don't have much time. So, sir, I just have one question. So it's okay to have a quick answer to this. So this is a question from Mr. Brian. So what was the best economic initiative done by South Korean government in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis to mitigate the economic impacts in the country?
Well, unfortunately, South Korea is facing with the general election tomorrow. And so therefore, a lot of issues handled by the government was somewhat election-related issues to some extent. So even though government has currently put up with some kind of fiscal policy stimulus package, the current one is trying to give some cash sort of payments to the household below top 70 up to 70% of income sort of scale. So up to lower 70% households are expecting to receive some cash sort of payments as a sort of stimulus package to let them survive from this terrible incidence of epidemics. But again, that will be a very limited policy. That will not salvage the economy. That will not salvage most of the small and medium enterprises. That will not be enough, sufficient enough. And they will have to put up second and third policies, which are more permanently designed to help recover their potential productivity. So it's all related to productivity enhancement, how to recover it efficiently. That's the issue of the governments will have to face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pyo, and thank you very much for emphasizing productivity, because after all, that's the mandate of the Asian Productivity Organization, to help member countries improve productivity. So actually we have many questions, but we cannot raise them now because of time limitation. But for our viewers, we will share to you the email address of Professor Pyo, and he's so happy to answer your questions. You can email him, you can also conduct Skype session with him. So I hope you don't feel bad that we cannot raise the questions here. So with that, the APO would like to thank Professor Pyo for his very informative, insightful, good sharing on his understanding and knowledge on the economics of a pandemic, especially on COVID-19 and its implications for productivity. So Professor Pyo, any final word?
No, thank you for joining me all. And I'm sure that Asia Pacific region as a whole, we will survive. We will be passing through this terrible pandemic. And I hope all of you remain healthy and survive this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, we would like to thank our viewers, and we look forward that you join us again in our next session. And please subscribe to our channel in YouTube so that you will be updated of our regular sessions on APO Productivity Talk. So thank you very much, and please stay tuned to our next webinar session this week. Further announcement will be provided later. Thank you, and see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.